Hey, what's going on? I'm Monz, and this is Monz on the mic, where we cover all of the chaos that is unfolding in the country and check out a couple of crazy cop videos once in a while we're at it. And if you're into crazy cop stories, check out my new book, 20 and Out. It's available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. And it covers all kinds of crazy stuff that I experienced during my 20 years in the NYPD. So let's dive right into this episode because I want to cover a lot of different things. So last time I talked about the George Soros links to the protests that are occurring in Minnesota. But it's not just limited to Minnesota. He has his hands and his money invested in anti American groups and causes all over the country. And the intent of this is to pit Americans against Americans, simultaneously destroying the moral fabric that our country was founded on. That's the ultimate goal: civil war. Soros pours money into revolting against the establishment violently. If you keep pushing buttons, eventually you're going to have a George Floyd moment and savagery is going to erupt. We've also seen a member of the Latin Kings break into an unmarked FBI vehicle during this civil unrest that followed the shooting of a Venezuelan man by ICE agents. That shooting occurred because Julio Cesar Sosa Celis was in the country illegally and had prior convictions for driving without a license and false impersonation. ICE attempted to apprehend him. He fled, crashed, and then continued to flee on foot. While ICE was struggling to handcuff this guy, two additional illegals jumped out and backed their buddy up and started attacking the ICE agents with a shovel. One ICE agent shoots the perp and he hits Sosa in the leg. All three of these animals were taken into custody, thankfully. Now, during the ensuing inevitable riots protesting the shooting of this individual who was attacking ICE agents with a shovel, as an aside, I'm really actually curious why someone would think that this shooting wouldn't be justified. So if you want to put in the comment section, I'd like to know, if you were being attacked with a snow shovel, what would your actions be? And if your response is, well, ICE shouldn't have been chasing this guy in the first place, well, then what should they do? You're going to let an illegal stay in the country? I went over in the last podcast the specific statutes that say that if you're here illegally, you can be deported, and ICE is the agency that enforces these laws. So are you saying that they should be derelict in their duty? I'm truly curious as to what is going on in the minds of those who support these anti-ICE protesters. So let me know. Put it in the comments. I'm truly curious. In any case, during the ensuing unrest, Raul Gutierrez, who is convicted of multiple prior felonies, including burglary and domestic assault, and is also a Latin King gang member, another wonderful person that has been added to our society, he breaks into an FBI vehicle and steals an M16, a suppressor, a Glock, ammunition, body armor, a laptop, and a radio. Now, this is beyond super concerning to me. First, why is a vehicle with all of this gear not being safeguarded? Where were the FBI agents? Why was this car left out and able to be broken into? When I did search warrants, ESU personnel would be in what we called the bread truck, right? And all of their heavy armor was in another van in the caravan. I would assign one cop to this van to protect the heavy firepower and body armor inside, and under zero circumstances was he to leave that vehicle. There was quite literally no situation, including a full-blown shootout with cops being shot, that the cop would be justified in leaving that van unsecured. So what the circumstances were in this situation, I would like to know. News outlets are reporting that although the perp is in custody and the M16 and the suppressor have been recovered, it says nothing about the other stolen items. So I'm presuming that they were not found. So we have a Glock firearm and extra ammo in the wind, which means that probably other people are going to get shot because of this, which means future victims, which is not good no matter how you look at it. We have a laptop containing potentially sensitive material, deployment plans, manpower numbers, communications between FBI agents. Who knows what other intelligence is on this laptop, and it's now in the hands of criminals who will most likely defeat whatever firewalls there are in place and recover all of this restricted information. Then you have the body armor, which you never want the enemy to have, and a radio, which is a huge problem because as long as that battery is working, the enemy has access to the movements and communications of the federal agents. Once in a while in the NYPD, a cop would lose his radio, whether in a foot pursuit or he would leave it in a restaurant or a bathroom somewhere. And the perps who found it would transmit over the radio threats to cops. I've heard it myself where you hear whispering, I'm going to kill you guys and all this crazy nonsense. I mean, we don't really care about it. We're not concerned. It's like a joke. But more importantly, they block the transmission of cops who maybe were calling for help or were trying to put over a car stop or some other priority. And once they're whispering their stupidity on the air, other cops really can't transmit. It gets broken up. There were a few times when whoever had stolen the radio played old radio transmissions, probably obtained through the internet, of cops screaming over the radio for help. So, and then there's silence after that. And for the next 10 minutes, there would be a scramble of Central playing back the tapes, trying to ID the voice of the person. Then a rundown has to be performed of all the units that are working that day. A lot of times there would be plainclothes units working that Central didn't have listed. So the sergeants have to get on and raise those units to ascertain if they're okay. Then you have outside borough units that would be assigned to the precinct for the day. You didn't even know about those guys. Then we're checking to see if anybody's working in the precinct that we're not aware about. So there's always the concern that they just got into some kind of shit and you didn't know where they were. So that's the reason why losing a radio is, I mean, you never want to have your communications capabilities hijacked by the enemy. So all of those things are worst case scenario. You don't want them in the hands of the enemy, and they are. So there you go. But back to the protests in Minneapolis. We had this guy, Jake Lang, who was an influencer and was marching in a pro-ICE rally, get swarmed by leftists. And he was stabbed and almost ripped limb from limb, according to his statement. Now we see that idiot Don Lemon leading a group of leftist commies into a church to disrupt church service under the guise of the pastor is an ICE agent. It seems that Don Lemon is desperate to maintain some legitimacy and get himself in front of a camera in some type of capacity. First of all, he isn't an ICE agent. But what happens if that pastor was an ICE agent? So what? What has Minnesota been allowed to devolve into? Mob rule? Are they going to start tarring and feathering people they suspect of being the enemy? Weren't they the ones crying for due process for the illegal child sex abusers that ICE was rounding up? So who makes them all of a sudden the arbiters of judgment on anyone who was pro-ICE? You cannot have it both ways. But like all things on the left, with one question, their entire argument collapses on itself. And they resort to name calling. So I'm anticipating the comments of you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, whatever the flavor of your day is. It doesn't matter to me. It's irrelevant. And why the hell, by the way, are the people in this church allowing this to happen? And doesn't that fact that they allowed these people to march into their church cut into the heart of what the issue is? All of these events have been the plan for many, many years. Slowly demonize the Good Samaritans. Let the Soros-funded DAs prosecute those who defend from evil. Take the true Americans like Daniel Penny, Charles Foner, who was serving 4 years in prison because the gun he shot and killed a man who was trying to rob him with was not licensed. I believe the Second Amendment does say shall not be infringed. I'm going to get into that in a future podcast, but we'll deal with that later. Jose Alba, a bodega worker, he stabbed a man to death, but the man attacked him in his store and he was charged with murder. The charges were later dropped, though, because of pressure from the public. You had George Zimmerman, Kyle Rittenhouse, Tanisha Green, all charged with murder when they were clearly defending themselves. Take these good people fighting evil and put them on trial, ruin their lives, send the message to anyone else out there who would dare to do the same. We will destroy you. Paralyze the opposition. And this message has been sent loud and clear. Once the good guys don't stand up to the bad overrun all. And that's the plan, and it's unfolding in front of our eyes. Minnesota is not necessarily ground zero for this. It has been attempted many, many times, just under different reasons. But this time it seems to be sticking. Maybe all the previous attempts, the BLM riots, the Occupy Wall Street, hands up, don't shoot, were the rally cry. Democrats on the Hill standing up for the criminals, spreading lies that were later disproven in court to the masses, and seeing who's going to be dumb enough to show up and fight for our cause. The top lets the bottom know, we got your back. Go out there, wreak havoc. And so they do. And now they have an army, a well-funded, well-organized army across the country, led by groups like the 50501 group I spoke about in my previous podcast. They have the manpower they need. They have the DAs in place to release the criminals. They have the cops under their thumb, just following orders to stand down. And they have any would-be patriots that would stand the line and defend the pro-ICE protesters or these people in the church, cowering in their living rooms, blood boiling, but not as of yet willing to sacrifice their freedom and their family's well-being for the cause. The scene is set. Now you just need the spark. And ICE gave it to us. And if Trump goes with the Insurrection Act, although as an aside, it's been done before and it's totally justified in this instance as well, but the optics are going to be intentionally bad. Look, troops are in the street. Trump is the dictator that we said he was. He's having troops shoot innocent people. Then more useful idiots will pour into the streets, and by the summer, we will have full-blown riots, and disorder. Because remember, it's like 5 degrees in Minnesota right now. Most people are not that dedicated to go out there and freeze their balls off to fight ice. Only the diehards are out there right now, and there's still a lot of them. Come warmer weather, if this lawlessness isn't quelled, this is going to be a worse summer than the George Floyd riots. As for the people in the church, what are you waiting for? The police to arrive? The cops are not coming. They've been told to stand down, which is its own problem, but we saw this coming with the COVID vaccine mandates. They mandated military and first responders to take the vaccine. Those of us who fought against it were weeded out. We actually took a stand against illegal orders, which is what all the Democrats are demanding that law enforcement does. And we were considered the dangerous ones at that time. We were the threat to the impending tyranny that was coming. That's why we were demonized. So we had to be quickly identified and neutralized. Now they have a police force filled with people who either buy into the tyrannical pro-America is bad bullshit, or they're too scared to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. They can't afford to lose their career. And therein lies the problem. People don't have multiple skills anymore like they used to 100 or 200 years ago. We can't grow our own food. We can't build our own houses or hunt and skin a buck and preserve the meat. We are completely dependent on the system. And the system has been hijacked by radicals. And now we have a police force that is standing down, failing to protect the very citizens that need it most. The ones whose First Amendment freedoms to right to worship are being violated by this leftist mob, who, by the way, is using tactics that Marxist revolutionaries have used for decades in other countries. A buddy of mine sent me a really interesting link, The Anarchist Library. It was written in 1869 by Sergei Nechayev. I encourage you to check it out. The Anarchist Library. It outlines the ideal person to be a revolutionary. It outlines the plans necessary to use violence to bring down a civilization. I'm going to quote from it for a moment because it's actually being used today, and I think you'll be able to see the parallels. The revolutionary enters the world of the state, of the privileged classes, and he lives in this world only for the purpose of bringing about its speedy and total destruction. He is not a revolutionary if he has any sympathy for the world. He must hate everyone and everything in it. The revolutionary may and frequently must live within society while pretending to be completely different from what he really is, for he must penetrate everywhere, into all the higher and middle classes, into the houses of commerce, the churches, and the palaces, into the worlds of the bureaucracy and literature and military. This filthy social order can be split up into categories. The first comprises those who must be condemned to death without delay. Hatred and outrage must be useful insofar as they incite the masses to revolt. The violent and sudden deaths will produce the utmost panic in the government, depriving it of its will to action. The second group are those who will be spared for the time being in order that, by a series of monstrous acts, they may drive the people into inevitable revolt. The next compromises ambitious office holders and liberals of various shades of opinion. The revolutionary must pretend to collaborate with them, blindly following them, while at the same time prying out their secrets until they are completely in his power. They must be so compromised that there is no way out for them. Then they can be used to create disorder in the state. The next category is women. They can be divided into 3 groups. 1, the vapid women, who will be used and put into compromising situations so they can be controlled. The second group of women are those who are ardent, capable, but are not devoted to us. These women must be constantly driven on to make compromising declarations. The majority of them will be destroyed. Finally, there are the women who are completely on our side. We should regard these women as the most valuable of our treasures. Without their help, we would never succeed. Do we see the parallels in this part of the plan and what's going on in the real world? Epstein, whose buddy Ghislaine's father worked for intelligence in Mossad, conducting honeypot operations, getting the rich and powerful into compromising situations with underage women, trapping them if they have a conscience and think about turning away. We have people like Hortman, who voted against funding the fraud-riddled entitlement programs and was killed for it. We see older white women at many of these anti-ICE protests, and now we have one dead. A poor woman killed by those mean white men in military uniforms. The parts about condemning people to death we may think is incomprehensible because we lived in a civilized country controlled by laws, but this has always happened when socialists take over. There's mass deaths, millions of deaths. And condemning to death doesn't necessarily right now mean kill them. It could also mean destroy their lives, their reputation, dox them. We have seen countless right-wing reporters and podcasters swatted. They have fake 911 calls placed on their homes, saying they're holding their wife hostage or have a gun to someone's head, prompting a heavy police response, which could really end in someone being shot in these tense situations. It's a waste of manpower. It creates an incredibly dangerous situation for all involved, including anybody who lives near the house. And we have seen anyone who speaks out against this narrative, like in Hollywood, have their careers railroaded. No jobs. Toe the line or you're cut. We saw social media silence anyone who spoke out against the vaccine, assassinate a person's character, and it's the equivalent of assassinating them. Look at Walz, the governor of Minnesota. Remember the circle was tightening around arresting him for allowing the fraud to occur? We get another glimpse into the scheme in the bigger picture here. Democrats appeal to the hearts of their followers. We need free childcare. We need money to help the homeless. We need money for this entitlement or that assistance program. They get public support for their programs so they can pass bills that will fund insane amounts of spending of tax dollars. Once the money starts flowing, unscrupulous groups like Somalis set up front organizations to receive the money, funneling it to their people wherever, or people here in America who aren't the intended recipients. Some of that money goes back into the Democrats' wallets. That's how we have people like Ilhan Omar who enter Congress with $65,000 in debt and now have a current worth of millions. The money helps keep supporters voting for them. And the appearance of these kind-hearted programs keeps the useful idiots voting for them as well. The cycle has worked for probably decades at this point, but was really ramped up during COVID with the spending programs that were created to counter the very lockdowns that the Dems put into effect. Now that questions are being asked and scrutiny is exposing the scams, the Dems realize they need to shine a flashy object to distract Americans so their treason is hidden. They rile up their base, some of whom are just blind morons who simply agree with whatever the Dems say without asking questions. Others are paid to lead those sheep, and others have been brainwashed in the public education system to believe America bad, Orange Man bad, and willingly join the fight on those principles alone. The ICE raids are a perfect way to distract from the fraud exposure. Dems once were on the bandwagon of deport illegals, but now it benefits them to want the illegals. One, because they've enabled illegals to vote by no ID laws and mail-in voting. Two, because of the incredible influx of cash hidden in these help the helpless funding programs. They direct their base through media to act, lying about the laws of our country and blurring lines between what is real, illegals or criminals, and need to be deported as per our laws, and what isn't. Citizens are being rounded up and imprisoned and deported. Knowing the useful idiots aren't going to ask what the facts are, and the rest are paid to support these positions. Now they can control the narrative and focus on ICE instead of the theft and treason. The Dems are so desperate to hide what they are doing, they're willing to allow this country to descend into civil war. Trump is deciding whether to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota right now. That will send troops pouring in to face off against the anti-ICE protesters. Will that be the spark, the next shot heard around the world? The optics of heavily armed military with tanks and big guns pointed at poor older white women and super skinny men who don't appear to be a threat to anyone except perhaps the local skate park are not ideal. But once again, we find the same problem. Dems create the problem, Trump does what's needed to stop the problem, and walks into the trap the Dems have already set. They want the military in the cities. The optics of that for them are phenomenal. It'll prove their argument that Trump is a dictator. It won't matter that the reason for sending in troops is justified. The media is not going to point that out. They'll make comparisons between Hitler and the Gestapo. All the while, it's actually the Dems using their Gestapo funded by tax dollars, as well as people like George Soros, who got a lot of money through USAID, who make money off of countries collapsing. Just before ICE became all we see in the news, fraud similar to what is occurring in Minnesota was discovered in Maine, New York, Kansas, Louisiana, Ohio, California, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Connecticut. You didn't hear about that though, right? Because all you're seeing is ICE, ICE, ICE. During the COVID-19 pandemic, fraud in unemployment insurance programs was widespread across many states as systems were overwhelmed and criteria were loosened. According to federal data and state audits, in Kansas, a legislative audit found as much as 25% of the almost $3 billion in unemployment claims were fraudulent. In Louisiana, officials identified $405 million in fraudulent or ineligible claims across tens of thousands of accounts. In Ohio, there was an estimated 13% of fraud rate in unemployment benefits. And in Alabama, California, Texas, and others also uncovered significant pandemic unemployment fraud. These figures show that large-scale fraud cases tied to emergency relief programs were not unique to Minnesota. But this is why they don't want to focus on all of this fraud, because it is so incredibly widespread. But let's look into more of it. What about welfare fund scandals? In Mississippi, they uncovered a major welfare fraud scandal involving misuse of temporary assistance for needy family funds, with auditors identifying roughly $94 million in questionable spending. High-profile figures were implicated in connection with nonprofits used to launder the funds. This is another example of state-level fraud investigation involving social welfare programs. While Minnesota's social services and Medicaid issues have drawn attention, similar healthcare fraud cases are being prosecuted nationwide. In New York, defendants pled guilty to a $68 million Medicaid fraud scheme involving false billing for adult daycare services that were never provided. Connecticut law enforcement charged individuals for submitting fraudulent Medicaid counseling claims. Additionally, large federal enforcement actions, including a national healthcare fraud takedown, have charged hundreds nationwide in schemes worth over $14 billion, reflecting systemic issues beyond any single state. National oversight reports underscore that fraud and improper payments across federal and state programs, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment, SNAP, etc., are widespread. Federal estimations show hundreds of billions in fraudulent or improper payments in unemployment insurance, PPP loans, and other relief and benefit programs. Improper payments in federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid alone have been large enough to dominate overall improper payment totals. These patterns highlight that program vulnerability to fraud is not just limited to Minnesota. It's a national issue. So we need a really big spark to hide the exposure of how the Dems are funding their corruption and lining their wallets. And this is why Trump had to be demonized, because he's not part of this. He can't be bought and paid for because he made his own money. He can't be controlled because he didn't fall for Epstein's honeypot schemes, using girls to lure the rich and powerful into compromising situations so it can be held over them for blackmail so they could be controlled by the ruling elites. In fact, he saw what Epstein was doing and banned him from Mar-a-Lago. There is some evidence that he was actually an informant for the federal government telling them what was going on. He is the only one who's working to defeat evil in this country and restore it to the pure foundations it was built upon. That is why Russiagate happened. That is why he was falsely accused of being associated with Epstein and his underage girls. Have you seen photos of Trump with any underage girls, like with Clinton and Prince Andrew? I haven't. But if the Dems put the fake info out there, people will believe it because they've been trained to just believe what they're told. There is a rot in this country, and it's not just with the Dems, but it's most definitely all the Dems. And if one steps out of line, like Congresswoman Hortman, they're taken out. Support the programs that give free handouts to the voters, funnel that money into Dems' pockets, and keep that liquid flowing, and you're with the in crowd. What Trump is doing is unraveling the carefully constructed corruption network that the Dems in power have created. He's working to strengthen America. This move with Greenland is a part of that. Of course, the narrative will be spun that he just wants to go in and take over countries like Hitler did. To the contrary, it remains to be seen if rule and order are restored or the anarchy that has taken over in Minneapolis spreads across the country. I hope that it doesn't. But the globalists and anti-American powers that be have been working towards this for decades. They have momentum now. And if this fire isn't put out, and put out quickly, and we have public trials of the corrupt politicians and the leaders of these groups that egg on these violent protests, it could be the beginning of the next civil war. I just want to talk briefly again about Mamdani and his plans to continue the rent freezes in New York City now that he's officially the mayor. That sounds really great, right? Freeze the rents in New York City. So let's say my rent is $2,000 a month, and knowing it won't go up when my utilities and everything else goes up, like groceries, etc., that really helps me out, right? But then the plumbing in my sink breaks. So I call my landlord to fix the leak. But the landlord can't afford to fix the leak. Why? Because he owns the building of, let's say, 10 apartments. And all of those apartments are fixed at $2,000 max a month income. The problem is the landlord also has to pay utilities and taxes and the mortgage on the building. He's got to pay insurance for the building. He's got to pay for exterminators. He's got to pay cleaning staff. He's got to pay the property manager or maintenance guy salaries. He's got to pay all these costs, which all go up. But the problem is he can't raise the rents to cover the increase in his costs. So now he's got to make cuts or he's going to go bankrupt, right? So he cuts maybe the exterminators, then maybe the maintenance guy or the management company, then maybe the cleaning staff. Eventually, it's inevitable that the repairs aren't going to be made because the landlord simply doesn't have the money to cover them. Everyone pictures landlords as these rich guys living in their penthouses. Not so. They have their own bills just like everyone else. And when they can't raise the rents, they can't pay their bills either. Another obstacle they have to overcome is that a lot of the time, and I dealt with this a lot when I was working, is that people just do not pay the rent. So maybe I'm like, hey, you know what? You didn't fix my leaky plumbing, so I'm not paying the rent. So now he's not getting any income from a few of these apartments. So that's even less money he has coming in to cover the bills. And in New York City, the tenant is favored overall. It costs a ton of money and takes over a year at least to get a person evicted for not paying the rent. The landlord is set up to fail. So now I've got a bunch of apartments that need repairs and the building itself is in disrepair, not just because of use, but also because people who rent don't have a vested interest in taking care of the property. They have the attitude that someone else is going to fix it. They don't have to pay for the repairs. So what do they care when things break? They also don't have any equity in the property. They don't care if property values fall because they're never going to lose money since they never invested any money in the first place. So the tenant then will call Mamdani's mayor's office to protect tenants and complain that their building is in disrepair. Two things can happen. The city can fix the issues and bill the landlord, which is usually reserved for hazardous conditions, but really, at the end of the day, anything can be considered hazardous. Or the tenant or the city can go to housing court and have a judge require the landlord to fix the violations. If the landlord still doesn't fix the problem, an Article 7A can be invoked, which means a housing court judge will appoint an independent administrator to run the private residential building. They collect rents and they use the funds to fix the problems. What Mamdani wants to do, as he said during his campaign, is to take over these problem buildings from the landlords under the newly revived Neighborhood Pillars program. The city buys the building, which works for the landlord since he's bleeding money anyway. And in many cases, like the recent Pinnacle debacle, the landlords go bankrupt. The city purchases the product. The city purchases the property for bottom dollar, and now you have city-owned and run buildings, which, as you have seen, or maybe not, but I've seen in the projects, goes just as bad or worse as rent-stabilized buildings. But it's part of the socialist playbook. The government owns everything. They own the housing, they own the businesses, they own the means of production. Mamdani has a few hurdles to overcome, but he seems fairly determined to turn New York City into his socialist dream by selling fool's gold. Once again, the city created the problem by selling the wonderfully warm idea of rent-stabilized apartments for the poor, which led to these horrific conditions. Then the landlords are demonized, so the city says, we're going to step in and save the day, create the problem, offer the solution, all the while the ignorant public thinks it's being helped when it's really being screwed. I think this is going to take some time for it to completely implement, so it'll remain to be seen, but we'll keep an eye on it. I'm also keeping an eye on Supreme Court cases that were heard last week about transgender people, children, being allowed in sports. The Supreme Court heard two cases with a lot of arguments on either side from all of the justices. We'll probably get that decision in June, but that will definitely see if transgender people are going to be able to be protected under Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. But let's end on a positive note. Here's a video from the NYPD's 7-3 precinct in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where some cops had a really great foot pursuit and got a guy with a gun. This cop did a great job putting over his location, remaining calm so everyone could hear and understand where he was at. And he kept up with this scowl to get a gun off the street. So just remember that while you're sleeping in your nice, warm, cozy beds, this is what is going on in the streets of inner cities all across America. Back your cops up. They aren't the demons you have been told that they are. I know, I was one of them. So let's check out this video.
Rockaway and Glenmore. Rockaway and Glenmore. Stop! Stop. Go on, don't go. There you go around. Wait, you up. I did it. Stand up.
And if you heard in the background, you could hear the sirens of the approaching police. And I tell you what, when you are in trouble and you hear those sirens coming, there is no better feeling than knowing that the cavalry is on their way and you just got to hold out a little bit longer. But that was a great grab. That magazine was an extended clip. It probably held like 30 rounds of ammo. But good job, as usual, NYPD cops holding it down. Be safe out there. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this content. And if you have a comment about this or any of my other podcasts, send me an email at monzonthemic@aol.com. I really like to hear opposing opinions, and let's keep this civil and try to find some common ground and have a discussion instead of having lynchings like we're seeing in Minnesota. And if you like true crime or if you think cops are corrupt and racist, I really encourage you to pick up my book, 20 and Out. It's filled with, like I said before, the stuff that I did during my 20 years as an NYPD cop and detective, and it might change your perspective on what policing really entails. It's available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle, and I'll see you next time.